It's the Powerful Communication Podcast. Let's look at the front of the Times of Scotland today, entitled Pupils Causing Chaos in Scotland Schools, Warn Experts. This is a report from the Commission on School Reform, which is a body of educational leaders and experts set up by a public policy institute called Enlighten. And it says that unruly pupils have developed an unthinking sense of entitlement that's fueling a serious and growing problem with behaviour in schools. It calls for head teachers to be given back the power to suspend and exclude disruptive pupils. It says there's a real problem with order. It blames the pandemic. It says basically children's education was downgraded, which it was. During the pandemic, the schools were closed. The message was Premier League football can continue. Governments will have parties, but you can't come to school. And so they're suggesting that this downgrading of children's education has now led to a situation where people think, I'll just do what I like. I'll just do what I like. And that parents have got a bit of that as well, and that they're siding with their children. And we've heard this for years now. Teachers facing violence, absolute insubordination, and finding it very difficult to create a stable, peaceful environment just to get the job done, just to educate children. The government, either wittingly or unwittingly, have created absolute mayhem in our schools. What really gets me is the quote that they've given to the Times in response to this. There's also figures quoted, by the way, from the Lib Dems that reports 40,382 violent incidents reported in Scotland schools in the 23-24 academic year. Now, I know that there's lots of incidents not reported. More than 40,000 violent incidents reported in our schools. And the Scottish Government response to this is, there's no place for violence or abuse in Scotland schools. Well, I think what everybody else is saying is, well, there quite clearly is. There quite clearly is a place for violence and abuse in Scotland schools, because when we look at the number of school exclusions in Scotland, and these are the Scottish Government's own figures, if we look just before the SNP come in 2006-07, 44,794 school exclusions. And if we follow it, let's go to just before the pandemic, because obviously the numbers dropped dramatically because of the pandemic. The schools were closed for part of the time. So 2018-19, 14,990. And then 2022-23, 11,676. Okay, so from 44,700 to, let's say, 14,900. A drop of 30,000. And yet we've got more than 40,000 violent incidents. On the face of it, you look at that, you think, wow, our children are behaving much better. What an improvement. The numbers have changed. But yet when we look at teachers leaving the profession in droves, we look at violent incidents, we look at the experience of children, we look at attainment, not exam results, but we look at attainment, it doesn't paint a very good picture at all. And the Scottish Government says there's no place for violence or abuse in Scotland schools. I say there very much is. There's abundant evidence that there is a place for violence and abuse in Scotland schools. Now, on the one hand, the Scottish Government, I think, is quite right to try and reduce the number of school exclusions. 44,000 seems hell of a high. And if we can do some work to bring that number down, yes, of course that's progress. And of course, if you just throw someone out of school, well then what happens next? What happens to them? Where do they go? These are people who've probably been very badly treated themselves, who will have experienced violence. We know all of that. I'm not saying that they don't need help and they don't need support, but keeping them in the school where they then are able to undermine and disrupt everybody else surely can't be the only answer. As usual, the Scottish Government, with good intentions, make things significantly worse. If I go to a football match and somebody creates violence around me at that football match, they will be taken out and removed because football's not a place for violence and abuse. And we know that and understand it. And so if somebody does that, generally speaking, they're removed. Why is that not happening in our schools? The Scottish Government says there's no place for violence and abuse. Well, if there's no place, then they should be getting removed. Still getting help and support, still being allowed back in, but we've got a culture at the moment where it's everybody else's fault. It's the teacher, it's the other kids, it's the environment, it's the lighting, it's the walls, whatever it is. And we bend over backwards and we disrupt everything for everybody else to accommodate the violent behaviour, the abusive behaviour. And that's what's happening. And the Scottish Government, all nice and cosy in theory, let's all be nice, let's all understand each other. Great. I'd love to live in that kind of country. That would be fantastic. But you need to resource it properly. You also need to be intelligent. And I don't think our government have either. They're not resourcing it properly, and they're also not smart enough. So when I see that quote in the newspaper today, there is no place for violence or abuse in Scotland schools. I'd love that to be true. There's the challenge.